The media referred to Nanny Doss as a giggling granny, the jolly black widow, the lonely hearts killer, and one newspaper dubbed her as a self-made widow. These were the appropriate nicknames given to a woman who spent the best part of 3 decades murdering people she knew well. Murders she eventually confessed to included 4 of her 5 husbands, yet it's been speculated that at least another 7 people lost their lives to this woman. Most of the deaths were caused by the use of arsenic or rat poison. When law enforcement finally caught up with this cold-hearted killer, she astounded them with a surprising statement regarding the motive behind her evil deeds. Hi my friend, I'm Royston, and welcome back to Tea and Crime. You've probably noticed every now and then we upload older or historical crime. And the reason for that is because, well, they fascinate me, and I think it's good to keep historical context alive. With regard to this particular character, being responsible for the untimely death of 11 family members clearly indicates something amiss within Nanny Doss. Yet due to her age as an older woman, no one suspected a thing. Perhaps it was connected to a head injury she suffered as a child. Those familiar with this case will point out her motive was financial gain. Yet when Nanny was caught after a long time of doing this, she explained a completely different motive was behind it. But let's start with the obvious. It's true she made several insurance claims after murdering her victims, meaning financial gain does actually stand out. But in addition to that, could her actions have been attached to some form of obsession with marriage? Like, did she believe her perfect man was out there, but she just couldn't find him? So when she married a man who didn't meet her expectations, she simply killed him and moved on. Or could it have been environmental? When growing up, she was severely controlled by her father, and this theme continued to an extent throughout her life, where other people, including some of her husbands, tried to mould her to conform to their standards. These are the things we're going to deep dive into in today's episode. Nanny Doss was actually named Nancy Hazel at birth, which took place on the 4th of November 1905 in a small town in Calhoun County, Alabama, situated between Jacksonville and Anniston. Her parents were James and Louisa Hazel. During the marriage of her parents, they had 5 children, 1 boy and 4 girls. Regarding the children, I'm only aware of 3 names. Nancy, who was known as Nanny, the one we're talking about today, her brother William, and one of her sisters, Dovey. Louisa, the mother, and Nancy, who I'll refer to as Nanny from now on, both hated James, Nanny's father. Perhaps William and the other 3 sisters didn't like him either. He was abusive as well as a control freak, forcing his children to work like slaves on the family farm or doing household chores, to the detriment of their education, as he preferred them working as opposed to attending school. At the age of 7, Nanny was on a train that suddenly abruptly slowed down, forcing her forward, in which she hit her head on a piece of metal attached to the seat in front of her. And she later mentioned that this incident, or bang to the head, was the cause of her future destructive behaviour. And it's interesting how many killers blame head injuries for their murderous pursuits. Have you noticed that? I mean, Dennis Rader, the BTK, was dropped by his mother as an infant. The mother of Henry Lee Lucas hit him with a piece of wood. Albert Fish fell out of a tree, resulting in concussion. And John Wayne Gacy felt the force of a swing. And all of these incidents or accidents made contact with the youngster's head years before they started killing. Whether or not those bangs to the head played a significant role in the crimes they went on to commit, I don't know. What I believe is that alone couldn't be the cause. Significant childhood trauma, alongside neurodevelopmental and social problems, makes a lot more sense why an individual might end up killing someone. Now, if it was simply down to a bang on their head, a lot more killers would be walking around the streets, don't you think? And you've probably had a nasty knock on your head somewhere along the line. I know I have. But in my opinion, that alone doesn't create a murderer or a monster. I don't know how you feel about this, but that can be corrected by leaving your thoughts down in the comments. By the time Nanny became a teenager, she developed an obsession with romance magazines, especially the Lonely Heart columns. Reading those magazines had to be done secretly behind her father's back, as he was against it. This led her to spending any free time dreaming about meeting the perfect man, fantasizing with reference to presenting herself attractively. As far as her father was concerned, he forbade any of his 4 daughters from wearing makeup. He also discouraged them from wearing the type of clothing that would attract men. Therefore, the girls were tightly controlled, not even being allowed to go dancing or attending social events within the community. His reasoning hinged on the opinion that if they followed his rules, men wouldn't take advantage of them. However, in 1921, at the age of 16, young Nanny found herself working at the Linen Thread Company in Anniston, where she met Charlie Braggs, who would have been around 18 at the time. They got on really well, as he impressed the young woman, even managing to win the approval of her father James. Within months of meeting, the seemingly happy couple were married. At last, she finally escaped from her father's regimental conditions, moving in with a new husband, while at the same time being presented with another issue. Her mother-in-law insisted on living with them, a woman who had a manipulative, controlling temperament that resembled her father's. Later on, Nanny wrote about the living situation of her first marriage, and you'll notice by the use of her words a lack of education, particularly as her father kept her from attending school. She wrote, "I married as my father wished in 1921 to a boy I only knowed about 4 or 5 months, who had no family, only a mother who was unwed, and who had taken over my life completely when we were married. She'd never seen anything wrong with what she'd done, but she would take spells. She would not let my own mother stay all night." Their relationship was affected living under that arrangement, which Nanny deeply resented. They were restricted with the things they wanted to do as a married couple, but one thing they did manage to do was have 4 children together between 1923 to 27. By then, both of them were terribly unhappy and rightly suspected each other of extramarital affairs. Charlie would frequently vanish for days while his stressed-out wife turned to alcohol. She also started to smoke casually, but that soon became a heavy addiction. By 1927, their marriage was in an awful state, and that was a year that marked the beginning of almost 3 decades of murder. Yeah, 2 of their 4 children died a few months apart from each other after eating breakfast. On both occasions, Charlie stated that when he left for work on those 2 separate specific mornings, the girls were crying. Nanny, on the other hand, failed to provide any information regarding what had happened, yet both deaths were mysteriously attributed to food poisoning. And not long after this, the couple divorced in 1928, and throughout his life, Charlie always maintained that he left Nanny because he was frightened of her. Now that was a good decision, because from the 5 men she married during her life, he was the only one that didn't die at her hands. Now divorced, Nanny was left with raising her 2 surviving daughters, when her obsession with romance magazines was rekindled, as she responded to men who advertised in the Lonely Hearts column. One of the men she replied to was 23-year-old Robert Errolson, a factory worker from Jacksonville. They'd write each other very long love letters, and he was fond of sending poetry to her. Eventually, they met and married in 1929, living together with their 2 children in Jacksonville. Within a few months, those previous love letters and poems seemed as if they came from a different person. The romance she anticipated from this relationship was short-lived, as Nanny discovered that Frank was an alcoholic with a criminal record of assault. He turned out being a vile character, not only as an alcoholic, but he was abusive and always in debt. When drinking at various public houses, it wasn't uncommon for him to get into bar fights, and his short fuse was directed at his new wife. Amazingly, the marriage lasted an incredible 16 years despite the unhappiness that came with it. It ended tragically when on the 15th of September 1945, Robert had been out drinking heavily with friends to celebrate the end of World War II. After his joyful last party, he returned home as drunk as ever and took advantage of his wife against her will by raping her. Not a good move at all. The following morning, on the 16th of September, a furious Nanny poured rat poison into a jar of moonshine that belonged to him. His life ended bitterly on that very day, aged 39. Nanny was once again free to resume her search for true love, browsing through the Lonely Heart column where she zoomed in on a man named Arlie Lanning. Lanning was from Lexington in North Carolina. He became Nanny's 3rd husband within 2 to 3 days of meeting. And on a positive note, he wasn't violent, but he suffered with alcoholism and enjoyed the company of women he wasn't married to. Now this created trouble. See, Nanny became prone to disappearing just like a previous husband did to her, But she did it for long periods, not just for days or weeks, but sometimes it went on for months. However, when she was around, her neighbours saw her as a doting wife, doing everything she could to hold the marriage together. According to his death certificate, he died in 1952 due to heart failure, after experiencing flu-like symptoms that were circulating within the neighbourhood. Doctors believed he died due to heavy drinking, and no one entertained the idea that it was under suspicious circumstances. In fact, Nanny received a lot of support from people within her community during the funeral. See, only Nanny knew the real cause of his death. She told people who were comforting her at the funeral that his last words were, "It must have been the coffee." Now, what she failed to tell them was, the coffee she made for him was filled with rat poison. The home they shared as a couple was left to Ali's sister for some reason, and Nanny was very aware of that. But not too long after his death, it mysteriously burnt down. Nanny ended up living with the deceased husband's mother for a while, and while there she managed to collect the insurance money connected to the torched house, which was followed by the sudden death of her mother-in-law, after which she quickly departed from the area, heading for her sister Dovey's home in Gadsden, 130 miles away, who at that point was terminally ill with cancer and bedridden. Her plan was to look after her sister, or so she made people believe. But shortly after arriving, Dovey, the sister with that unusual name, died. After that, Nanny pondered over her use of the classified ads and realised it wasn't bringing in the man of her dreams. So she tried a new approach by joining a singles dating service known as the Diamond Circle Club, where she met her fourth husband. He was a man named Richard Morton from Emporia, Kansas, and they tied the knot in January 1953, inside a year of murdering her previous husband. They settled down together in Kansas, and one thing different about this particular character was that he didn't drink. Or if he did, he certainly wasn't an alcoholic. Could this be the man she was looking for? Well, she soon discovered news about him. Yeah, he still had a thing for an ex-girlfriend he couldn't seem to get out of his system, sleeping with her on the side. Once this registered with Nanny, his life was severely shortened. But before she could do anything about it, family issues got in the way. See, her father died, which to Nanny was an inconvenience as she literally hated him. Plus her mother suddenly announced she was moving in with them. However, within 3 days of Louisa's arrival and after complaining about severe stomach cramps, she was dead. Nanny could now turn her full attention to her cheating husband, who left planet Earth 3 months later, in a similar way to Louisa, and they'd only been married for 4 months. This made it possible to start looking for another husband who she met and married in 1953, within a month or two of killing Mr. Morton. His name was Samuel Doss, but unknown to Nanny, her luck was about to run out. Mr. Doss had already experienced severe trauma in his life when a tornado ripped through his home in 1945, killing his whole family, including his wife at the time, a lady named Winnie, and at least 6 of his children aged between 3 to 16. He was visiting his brother when the tragedy occurred, and that's why he survived. He was a clean-cut church-going type of a man who lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that's where Nanny relocated to in order to join him. He was the polar opposite to Nanny's previous husbands. He wasn't a drunk, a womanizer, or someone who'd abuse others. Maybe he could be her Mr. Perfect. But we need to remember we're talking about Nanny Doss, who found something in him she didn't like. He was rather boring. He kept a close eye on finances, never spending more than required. He was set in his ways, going to bed every night around 9:30 p.m, and expected his wife to do the same. He was a little bit like a father regarding romance magazines or books because he didn't allow material like that in his home. He additionally controlled what TV shows his wife watched, and after a while, Nanny had had enough of this boring existence, and one day she just simply left him, making her way back to Alabama, refusing to return. His regimental lifestyle could have been a lifesaver, but he made the innocent mistake of begging his wife to come back, even promising to change his ways. One of the conditions that did the trick was when he agreed to take out a couple of life insurance policies with Nancy, or Nanny, as beneficiary. She was now back with him, and not long after this, he left, not of his own accord, but he was admitted to hospital complaining of horrendous stomach cramps. where he was diagnosed with a severe digestive tract infection. What the hospital didn't know was that Nanny had fed him a prune cake laced with arsenic. After treatment, he was discharged a few weeks later, which surprised his wife as she expected him to die. When he returned home, she wanted to get it right this time around, as the plan was to cash in on those life insurance policies. Therefore, Nanny reverted to a tried and tested method that always seemed to work. So she filled his mug of coffee with arsenic and watched him drink it. Within a few days, the poor man succumbed to his death. This turn of events made the doctor who treated Samuel for a few weeks previously instantly suspicious, prompting him to order an autopsy. See, her fifth husband's stomach held a ton of evidence, a ridiculous amount of arsenic that could have killed several men. Now, this sinister finding would bring an end not just to the horrendous killings, but to the evil woman behind them, as the doctor alerted the authorities. Finally, after almost 30 years since her first kill, Nanny was arrested on suspicion of murder. She initially told them her husband died from natural causes, yet the police who questioned her couldn't understand why the 48-year-old was so jolly, expressing a wide grin across her face with a tendency to smile and giggle when discussing the death. Eventually, while being interrogated, Nanny made a weird request. If she was permitted to keep a romance magazine, she'd tell the truth. The police agreed, and Nanny went on to confess not only to murdering her last husband, Samuel, but that 4 of them died at her hands after consuming arsenic or rat poison mixed with their favourite meal. And if that failed, a cup of coffee would do the job, provided it was laced with copious amounts of arsenic. In fact, several bodies from among the victims were exhumed, showing they ingested large amounts of poison. Overall, she murdered 4 husbands, yet authorities also suspected she was responsible for the deaths of her 2 biological daughters from the first marriage, 2 of her grandchildren, the mother-in-law she stayed with after the death of her 3rd husband, Ali Lanning, her sister Dovey, plus her own mother, Louisa, although she always denied being responsible for these additional suspicious deaths, even though she was in their company around the time they died. Now that's a total of 11 people, but there could have been many more for all we know. Nanny had a surprising motive when it came to killing her husband. She explained it wasn't about insurance money, but was connected to the profound effect romance magazines had on her. In her own words, she said, "I was searching for the perfect mate, the real romance in life." Now, if that's true, it doesn't explain why she destroyed the lives of other family members. And I guess she was able to get away with her murders for almost 3 decades because most of her husbands experienced underlying health, issues, such as heart conditions, while at the same time, Nanny looked and behaved like the doting housewife. Her friends and the authorities never suspected a thing until it was too late. Which leads to the 17th of May 1955, where she pled guilty to the murders of her husbands with a smile on her face. The state of Oklahoma didn't pursue the death penalty but sentenced her to life imprisonment, and she went there giggling, where she remained until her death. The giggling granny died due to leukemia on the 2nd of June 1965, aged 59.